Hello everyone, it's Scott, and we're back for day 3 of Modern Horizons 3 spoilers. We got a lot of interesting cards to talk about today. A Titan from Theros is with us, and then we've got a number of other quality rares to talk about, and then we've got some more of our MDFCs from the set to talk about as well. So we got a lot of good stuff to talk about, so let's jump right in to Modern Horizon 3 spoilers. So first we've got Flage, Titan of Fire's Fury. For 1, a red and a white mana, you get a legendary creature. That's an Elder Giant. That's a 6/6. And when Flage enters the battlefield, sacrifice it unless it escaped. Whenever Flage enters the battlefield or attacks, it deals 3 damage to any target, and you gain 3 life. So great ability. Every time it enters the battlefield or attacks, your opponent loses 3, you gain 3. Very nice ability. And then you can escape it for 2 red and 2 white mana, and exile 5 other cards from your library. So I think this really reminds me a lot of the Titans that we got from the last Theros set. That same idea of paying 4 mana, 2 of each color. And I can see this actually going into potentially a couple copies into the modern burn deck, because in essence, every time you're attacking, you're going to be burning your opponent. And I think there's a place for that in modern to give that deck a little bit more power. And quite frankly, in any modern Boros deck, I think this is probably a pretty decent card to play in those decks. Next, we've got Argent Dais. For 1 and a white mana, you get an artifact. Argent Dais enters the battlefield with 2 oil counters on it. Whenever 2 or more creatures attack, put an oil counter on Argent Dais. And for 2, you can tap it and remove 2 oil counters from Argent Dais and exile another target non-land permanent. Its controller draws 2 cards. So kind of an interesting ability. If you need it to remove troublesome cards on your opponent's side, you can do that. But also, if you are going to lose something and you can go ahead and spend the 2 mana, tap it, you can exile it before your opponent gets to kill it, and then you benefit by drawing 2 cards. And that's where I see this probably being played, is something that's going to provide some value for your cards when they die on the field, because you'll be able to hopefully pay that 2 mana, remove the 2 oil counters, and then also go ahead and get those 2 cards when you exile one of your own creatures, because it's not your opponent's, it's just a non-land permanent that you're looking at. And that's any non-land permanent that might be dying, you could do this for. So I think this has got definite playability in the right deck in standard, and maybe a Phyrexian deck is where this belongs. Next, we've got Wrath of the Skies. For X and 2 white mana, you get a sorcery, and you get X energy counters. Then you may pay any amount of energy, destroy each artifact, creature, and enchantment with mana values less than or equal to the number of energy paid this turn. So this is a pretty powerful board wipe, because it's not only going to kill creatures, it kills artifacts, it kills enchantments, and you get to put in the X value here. So you want to, hey, I want to get rid of everything that's 4 value or less. I can pay, I've got 6 mana, I can pay for that. And the big thing here is you can pay any amount of energy. So if you've got energy from something else, you can go ahead and pay that, as well as whatever you're going to pump into Wrath of the Sky. So you might be able to do this for 3 or 4 total mana and do a pretty good job of cleaning out the opponent's board, because of the amount of energy you've already got on hand that can go ahead and pay this. So I like this card. It's definitely going to be a sweeper we're going to see in limited for sure, and potentially in any kind of modern energy deck. Next, we've got a couple black rares to talk about in Emperor of Bones and Warden Soul Trader. So Emperor of Bones costs 1 and a black mana. You get a Skeleton Noble, that's a 2/2. And at the beginning of combat on your turn, exile up to 1 target card from a graveyard. Then you can pay 1 and a black mana to adapt 2, which puts 2 +1/+1 counters on Emperor of Bones. And whenever 1 or more +1/+1 counter are put onto Emperor of Bones, put a creature card exiled with Emperor of Bones onto the battlefield under your control with a finality counter on it. It gains haste, and then you sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. So great card here. I really like this card, and I think it has in a skeleton deck certainly some playability, but it probably has playability beyond that. Any deck that's got some graveyard synergy is certainly something you could consider using this for, because paying 2 mana, adapting to, getting to put a card that you've exiled onto the battlefield is a very powerful ability. So the first time you probably won't get to use unless something else has died already. But in subsequent turns, you're just going to be able to use over and over again, not only growing the Emperor Bones, but also then getting all that extra damage in from the creatures you're able to bring back from your graveyard. Warden Soul Trader. For 2 and a black mana, you get a zombie goblin wizard. That's a 3/3, and it has the ability of paying 1 life, sacrifice another creature, and you get to create a treasure token. So I can see this being played in any kind of artifacts matter deck, but also any deck that is centered around zombies or goblins or wizards. There might be a way that this card fits in there, especially if you have other ways of gaining life to offset the life that you're going to lose by sacrificing creatures. And tokens, I think, is another good place for this, because you can hopefully sacrifice enough creatures to get your mana supply large enough to cast some of the really large creatures that we have in Modern right now. Next, we've got Disruptor Flute. For 2, you get an artifact that has flash, and as Disruptor Flute enters the battlefield, you get to choose a card name, and spells with the chosen name cost 3 more to cast. Activated abilities of sources with the chosen name can't be activated unless they're mana ability. So that flash is an interesting effect here, because if you flash this in, you can choose a card that your opponent is playing or trying to play at that point, and now you've made the cost 3 more. So if they can't pay that cost, it is going to end up countering the spell. And then for things that are actually on the battlefield, then you're going to make it so they can't activate those abilities unless they're mana abilities. So I think this is something that certainly will be a sideboard card in some of the Modern decks. Next, we have Sky Master's Vault, and it enters the battlefield tapped unless you control a swamp, and it taps for black mana. And for 1 black mana, you can tap it, and target creature you control connives X times, where X is the number of creatures that died this turn. So I don't think this is a 4 of in a deck, but I think in any black deck, you might want one of these in that deck, so that way you've got an ability to go ahead and connive on one of your creatures a number of times, and the result of that is you can filter through your library a little faster, and that will help you kind of find the pieces that you need to win the game. Next, we've got some lower rarity cards from today, and the first is Tamiyo Meets the Story Circle. For 1 and a blue mana, you get a saga, and as the saga enters, and after each draw step, add a lore counter, and you can sacrifice it after the 3rd chapter. So on chapter 1, until your next turn, whenever a creature attacks you or a planeswalker you control, it gets -2, -0 until end of turn. So, protecting anything that's on the board by reducing its ability to do combat damage. On its chapter 2 ability, you get to discard any number of cards, then investigate twice for each card discarded this way. So if you got 3 or 4 cards in your hand that are kind of dead cards, you can go ahead and discard them. This is going to allow you to investigate twice that number, so 6 in this case. And then on chapter 3, you can shuffle up to 3 target cards from your graveyard into your library. So with chapter 2, you're going to be discarding some things. So with that in mind, you can discard some things into the graveyard that on the next turn you'll simply be able to get back, and that'll increase that ability to investigate as a result of it. Next, we've got Path of Annihilation. For 3 and a green mana, you get an enchantment with the Void, and when Path of Annihilation enters the battlefield, create 2/0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn creature tokens with sacrifice this creature to add a colorless mana. Eldrazi you control have add 1 mana of any color. Whenever you cast a creature spell with mana 7 or greater, you gain 4 life. So a lot of things here to unpack. First, 4 mana is probably a little bit high for this in terms of the overall cost, because you're really only going to get 2/0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawns that can be sacrificed for mana, which is a nice ability. and then any of those Eldrazi's you control. Once you have this down, you can add 1 mana of any color, and then you get a bigger payoff when you're casting those really large spells towards the end of the game by gaining 4 life every time. So I think there's maybe in the right kind of deck, there is some modern playability, but I'm not really sure where it would fit in well. Next, we've got Reckless Pyro Surfer for 1 and a red mana. You get a human scout with haste. It has landfall, and whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, Reckless Pyro Mage gains battle cry until end of turn, where whenever this creature attacks, each other attacking creature gets +1/+0 until end of turn. Each instance of battle cry triggers separately. So you can actually go ahead and cast or have multiple lands come into play on a given turn, and each of those is going to activate the battle cry ability on Reckless Pyro Surfer. And we know with the fetch lands, that's probably relatively easy to do. So I think there is some playability for Reckless Pyro Surfer. Next, we've got Marionette Apprentice. For 1 and a black mana, you get a 1/2 Human Artificer with Fabricate 1. And when this creature enters the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on it or create a 1/1 colorless servo artifact creature token. And whenever another creature or artifact you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, each opponent loses 1 life. So your opponent killing your stuff actually costs them life, so there's some playability in that, but I don't think it's really strong enough given the power level of Modern. Next, we've got Collective Resistance. For 1 and a green mana. You get an instant with Escalate, which costs a green mana. Pay this cost for each mode chosen beyond the first, and you can destroy an artifact, destroy an enchantment, or a creature gains hexproof and indestructible until the end of the turn. So great abilities here, and I think this is something that will be played some in Modern because of the flexibility of the card. Being able to hit not only enchantments but artifacts, and then also be able to protect your creatures is incredibly valuable in Modern. Next is Victimize. For 2 and a black mana. You get a sorcery and you get to choose 2 target creature cards in your graveyard. You get to sacrifice a creature, and if you do, return the chosen card to the battlefield tapped. So I really like this card because it is a very cheap way to get, in essence, 2 creatures out of your graveyard. And we know there's a lot of good discard strategies in Modern right now, so I think this fits into those decks pretty well. Next, we've got our first MDFC for the day in Razorgrass Ambush. For 1 and a white mana, you get an instant, and Razorgrass Ambush deals 3 damage to target attacking or blocking creature. So a little overcosted. We see this for 1 mana right now in Standard, but again, you get that advantage of Razorglass Field on the backside, and this is one of the lands where you can pay 3 life to have it come into play untapped. Otherwise, it does come into play tapped, and in this case, you get white mana. So I think it's definitely a decent card to put in any white mana base you want because of that dual ability. Early in the game, you may need the land, but then later, you can use the ambush side of the card to take out an attacking or blocking creature. Next, we've got Sink into Stupor. For 1 and 2 blue mana. You get an instant, and you get to return target spell or non-land permanent an opponent controls to its owner's hand. So an unsummon effect. And on the backside, you get Sulfuric Springs. And again, you can pay 3 life to have it come into play untapped. And otherwise, it'll come on in tapped. And it's a blue mana. So this is one of the ones that I don't think I would expect to see this one played very much, because normally those effects of returning a non-land permanent to its owner's hand or returning a spell, usually that kind of costs 2 mana or 1 mana. So I think this is a little bit overcost, but the ability to return a spell might be worth it in the right build of a deck. Next, we've got Fell the Profane. For 2 and 2 black mana. You get an instant, and you get to destroy target creature or planeswalker. And then again, on the backside, you get Fell Mire. And again, you can pay 3 life to have it come in untapped, or It enters the battlefield tapped, and it produces black mana. This is one I think we'll see play because we had in the last Zendikar set a card similar to this that did see play in black, where it was able to take out things. So for, based on all the cheap removal that we've seen of late, is a high cost, but again, that ability to have this as a spell late in the game rather than a land, I think makes it playable, and that flexibility of killing a creature or a planeswalker definitely helps. Next, we've got Bridgeworks Battle for 2 and a green mana. You get a sorcery where target creature you control gets +2/+2 until end of turn. It fights up to one target creature you don't control. So this is going to be on your turn where you're going to take out one of your opponent's creatures by fighting it, and then maybe attack after that, but maybe not as well. So I think there's some playability in that in Modern, because you're getting those two effects. But again, it costs 3 mana rather than 1 or 2, and that makes it a little bit less playable in Modern. On the backside, you get Tangle, Span, Bridgeworks, and again, you can pay 3 life to have it come into play untapped, and then if you don't, it comes into play tapped, and it's going to produce green mana for you. So I think there's some playability for this in the right kind of deck in Modern, but this isn't one I think we'll see a lot of play. Next, we've got some commons for the day that I want to quickly talk about. And first, we have Cranial Ram for a black and a red mana. You get an artifact that's an equipment. It has Living Weapon. When this creature enters the battlefield, create a 0/0 black Phyrexian Germ creature token, then attach this to it. Equipped creature gets +X/+1, where X is the number of artifacts you control, and you can equip it for 2 mana. So if your Germ dies, then you can equip it to something else. So, a decent piece of equipment for 2 mana. You've got something that is in limited, definitely a card that you would want to consider. But outside of that, probably not seeing much play. Next, we have Skola Ember Mage for 4 and 2 red mana. So very high cost on this one. It's a Goblin Wizard. That's a 4/4. And when Skola Ember Mage enters the battlefield, it deals 4 damage to any target. So you got that added ability of doing 4 damage to something. And then it has Grandeur, discard any card name Skola Ember Mage, and sacrifice 2 mountains. And Skola deals 4 damage to any target. So you got that ability to sacrifice the mountains, discard another copy of this creature, and you can do 4 damage to something else. Maybe limited playable, but probably not going to see much standard play at all. Next, we've got Kami of Jealous Thirst for 2 and a black mana. You get a Spirit with Death Touch. That's a 1/3. And for 5 total mana, 4 and a black mana, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. This ability costs 4 and a black mana less to activate. If you've drawn 3 or more cards this turn, activate only once each turn. So if you play this in a deck where you've got a lot of card draw naturally in it, I think this is a card that you may consider, certainly in limited, and maybe certainly in a popper deck. It may be a really nice card to have, but probably not going to see much modern play at all. Next, we have Drouse Claw for 1 and a black mana. You get an equipment that is an artifact. It again has Living Weapon, and equipped creature gets +1/+1. And whenever equipped creature attacks, each opponent loses 1 life, and its equip cost is 2. Again, decent in a limited format, but probably not going to see any modern play at all. Okay, our last 2 cards of the day are Tune the Narrative for 1 blue mana. You get an instant where you get to draw a card and get 2 energy counters, and I think this is a good card. I think this is not only going to see modern play, it'll see popper play, or any deck really that wants energy. This is a great way to do it. For 1 mana, you get a card, which is the rate that we typically see for that ability, and then you get the additional energy cost. So I think this is going to see play in blue modern decks. And our last card of the day is Conduit goblin. For a red and a white mana, you get a goblin warrior who's a 2/2, and when conduit goblin enters the battlefield, you get 2 energy counters, and then at the beginning of combat on your turn, you pay 1 energy counter. If you do, another target creature you control gets +1/+0 and gains haste until the end of the turn. And I think that ability to give something else haste for 1 energy might be enough to make, in the right kind of deck, this card playable, because giving haste to something, you got a big creature like Terror of the Peaks or something like that you want to get into play and attack with right away. Well, this gives you that ability, so I think it has some potential in Modern to be played. All right, those are the day 3 cards for Modern Horizons 3. Hope you enjoyed the video. Remember to like and subscribe to get further Modern Horizon 3 spoiler videos throughout spoiler season. And I will see you next time.